What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and I am back today to talk about the EOS R5 again. So I'm continuing my project looking at the EOS R5 and a whole slew of features. And in this episode, I am going to take a slight detour from talking about performance and capabilities and all that kind of stuff and the user interface and all the, usual jazz that you talk about when you're talking about a camera. And I'm going to talk about 10 features or updates or modifications or improvements that I would like to see Canon make to the EOS R5. Now, most of the time when somebody does one of these kinds of videos, they're probably going to say things like, I'd like unlimited 8K recording. I'd like 60 megapixels and 30 frames a second or something like that. It's kind of going to be, usually going to be big feature things that would kind of like require the camera to be re-engineered or, a completely new camera to be released. And, the reality is going forward, Canon is going to release new cameras. They are going to have better specs and performance. I mean, that's just the reality of time. What I'm talking about in this video are things that I think Canon could do right now with the camera that would not have, one, a tremendous amount of development cost for Canon. It would have some, obviously, but two, would just go a long way towards sort of taking an already good camera and making it that little bit better. So first on my list is removing the 30-minute video recording clip limit. Now, obviously, this isn't going to stop the thermal-related issues when shooting 8K or shooting 4K 60 or 4K 120 or whatnot. I'm not asking for Canon to redesign the camera. I just would like the 30-minute clip limit to go away. Personally, I'd like it to go away on all my DSLRs. I can't stand it. Now, I know there's two arguments here, right? So first of all is, why is it there? Now, a lot of people will tell you that the clip limit is imposed because camera companies are trying to protect their higher end products and blah, blah, blah. And I mean, there's obviously going to be some of that, right? So Canon has the cinema cameras, they have unlimited recording. They also have a lot of stuff that a mirrorless camera doesn't have for shooting video. And they lack some things mirrorless cameras have for shooting video, or even DSLRs, like size. The smallest cinema cameras Canon makes are way bigger than the R5 or a 5D Mark IV. However, the most telling thing about the whole 30-minute record limit is if you look at Panasonic, they don't put a 30-minute record limit on any of their cameras except for those sold in the European Union. And if you do some digging, you find out that the European Union imposes some pretty substantial tariffs on cameras, on video cameras, which they define as cameras that record more than 30 minutes. So, record video for more than 30 minutes. And so to avoid having these cameras be taxed as if they were video cameras, they don't record more than 30 minutes. Now, like I said, I don't live in the European Union. I really hate the fact that I'm getting screwed over by EU tariffs, essentially, and a bit of laziness, because I think when push comes to shove, Canon could very easily sell USA and global cameras that don't have 30-minute clip limits, and then sell European cameras that do, and have some kind of technical measure, or I don't even know if they need a technical measure to basically deal with the fact of the tariffs or whatnot. However, from my perspective as a guy who's shooting, say, these YouTube videos, and many of my YouTube videos run longer than 30 minutes, having to keep a timer running really does impose a significant cognitive load to my shooting when I'm doing videos. Likewise, I have had no end of problems doing oral histories of family members where I want to just record and talk to them and not have to constantly be managing the fact that the camera has to restart. And we know, like in the case of the R5, that if you're shooting 1080p or 4K 30, there really is no technical limitation for the camera to not have unlimited recording. It doesn't thermal throttle, it doesn't time out, it doesn't die. In fact, Several people have demonstrated that if you're not using the onboard compression, so if you're shooting and using the HDMI out to go to an external recorder, you can shoot the full 8K sensor, that high quality 4K mode, so the 8K sensor downsampled to 4K. You can shoot that for like 4 or 5 hours and the camera won't overheat. So number one, Canon, I'd like to have the 30-minute clip limit removed, and I would actually pay for this. I was not interested in paying for Canon log when on the 5D Mark IV when they announced that, but I would actually pay to have a 30-minute clip limit removed from my R5, and quite honestly from my 5D Mark IVs, because I shoot more video on them than I do with the R5. Number two on my list is synthesizing long exposure, or synthesizing neutral density effect for long exposures. So I have become a huge proponent of the idea of essentially stacking and averaging frames to get a neutral density effect on a long exposure image. It provides, or the effect of having a high density neutral density filter for a long exposure image. It provides a vastly improved image, actually. Every time you average, or all of the images that you're stacking and averaging, which, bear in mind, this is a technique that astrophotographers use to massively decrease noise and massively improve the signal-to-noise ratio, that every frame you're averaging in is pulling the noise down, which is increasing your dynamic range because it's lowering the noise floor, and it's generally just making the image better. And of course, on top of that, there's a whole bunch of other advantages in sort of synthetic stacking of neutral density. For example, you don't have color cast or color shifts. With a neutral density filter, it's very difficult to make a, like, say, 10-stop neutral density filter that is perfectly neutral and uniform across the entire color spectrum. What normally happens is either the blues, it lets a little more blue through, or it lets a little more red through, or a little bit of both, and you get a color shift in your image. In fact, when I first started shooting with 10-stop neutral density filters, the filter that I had was super neutral, and it was so bad, there was so much of a color shift in it that you couldn't fix it by anything other than converting the image to black and white. Now, I'm going to do a video talking about this a lot more, but this would be something that I think Canon could add to the camera that is pretty easy. They already have a multi-frame exposure mode, and it can average up to 8 or up to 9 images, including an image that you pull off of that you've already saved. So you can kind of do this effect in the camera already. It's just clunky, and it would be so much easier to do this using, like, basically Canon could take what they already have with the multi-shot exposure averaging mode and just give us a better UI to do long exposure neutral densities. Now, there's also a lot that could be done to make it even better than what it is, but just being able to tell the camera, give me the equivalent of a 6-stop neutral density and then hit the shutter release and have it do everything for me, would be a vast improvement on what Canon has already got in the multi-shot exposure. And so that's why I said, a lot of these things are things that I think the camera, it's a tweak. The capability is already there in the camera. It just needs to be tweaked and expressed to be more capable than what it currently is. Okay, number 3 on the list is an auto selection mode for the electronic and mechanical first curtain shutters. So first curtain electronic shutter has, on this camera, by and large, the first curtain electronic shutter is perfectly fine. You don't lose image quality, you don't lose dynamic range, it doesn't harm anything largely for the image for the vast majority of shooting conditions. However, there is one instance where first curtain electronic shutter can become problematic, and that's when you're shooting with a fast lens, wide open, so f1.4 or f1.2, and you're shooting at a very high shutter speed, so a 4,000th of a second, a 2,000th of a second, an 8,000th of a second, something in that range. And what happens is the out of focus highlights, the bokeh, it's degraded. And it has to do with the fact that the mechanical shutter that's stopping the light is offset physically in the camera from the front of the sensor, which is essentially where the electronic shutter is. And this offset causes, with fast lenses, some interesting, it's actually a very interesting optical situation. But it basically, you don't get round bokeh in the, especially in the periphery of the frame. So what do you do to fix it? Well, what you do now if you're shooting in those conditions is you switch the camera manually to mechanical shutter. What I'm suggesting is that, well, Canon already knows the conditions that this occurs in, that this becomes a problem, because they already know that it becomes a problem with a certain speed lens. I don't, like, us as photographers, unless you sit down and do the math and have all the measurements and everything, you're never going to exactly know what the timing offsets are, what the exact shutter speed and aperture conditions are. But Canon does know this because they engineered the camera. So Canon knows this, and Canon could very easily give us an option in the shutter speed selection mode for an auto mechanical, fully mechanical / electronic first curtain shutter mode, where the camera would always shoot in electronic first curtain unless it got into these states where the combination of aperture and shutter speed is such that it would render the bokeh wonky, and then it would just switch to mechanical. Interestingly, Nikon already does this. Nikon has on their Z6 and Z7 cameras a auto mode for whether they shoot electronic or mechanical shutter. Their menus are a little wonky on the whole thing in general, but they already do have this kind of thing. And there's no reason that, it's a simple software tweak, there's no reason that Canon couldn't add it to the R5, R6, etc. Number 4, customizing the quick control menus. So Canon made a big deal with the 7D and then the 5D Mark III and the 5D Mark IV and the 1DXs and so on and so forth, that you could customize the quick control menu on the rear LCD on those cameras. And now, admittedly, when you switch to mirrorless, the quick control menu kind of changes. It's not just a screen on the back of the camera with your settings on it, it's also the superimposed overlay when you're in the viewfinder or in live view and you're shooting. Now, when they went to mirrorless, that went away. We lost that feature. And now, as I said, yes, the implementation in mirrorless is a little bit different than the implementation in a DSLR or the way things work. But, you know, having the ability to customize things like that, what options are on there, or just get rid of options you don't need. And they have this customization capability in other functions on the camera. I think it's something that's super beneficial to us as photographers. So, you know, for example, on the quick control screen, there's a whole pile of things I don't actually use. And they just clutter up the menu, or worse, I could have a function there that I do use but can't, and so I have to go through menus to get to it. So for me, it's things like the picture styles, the auto light optimizer, anti-flicker shooting mode, and the touch shutter. I don't use any of those. If I needed to turn those on because, or change, say, the picture style, because I do it so rarely, I would be very happy to just go through the menu and get to that. However, there's other things like turning on viewfinder grids or easily switching between 1.6 and full frame, which actually is an option in the quick control menu, but I would like it to just be a simple toggle, or, you know, things like that I would like to be able to like customize into that menu, or for that matter, just get rid of, because I'm not using it, the like right column of icons in the viewfinder, because most of the stuff there isn't necessary for me to have. Actually, most of the stuff in the left column of icons are like metering and autofocus modes. I control other ways anyway through the dials or the MFN button, that I don't necessarily need to have a constant display of that. But like I said, would be really nice to be able to toggle and change settings in the quick control menu for change what we can have there. So number 5 on the list, customize the rate and lock buttons. I don't know what it is with Canon and the rate button, but they have never allowed you to program the rate button to do anything but rate pictures. And I never do that. I mean, I'm not saying that somebody doesn't do that or it's a function that nobody needs to have, but if you never use the rate button, it does absolutely nothing for you but be another button on the camera that doesn't do anything. And more than anything that I've seen in any Canon camera in the past, the R5 has so many functions and so many features, and there's so much stuff that I want to be able to toggle on for this or toggle off for that or switch easily because of, as I said, the just volume of functions and capabilities in the camera, that I constantly feel like I'm under-buttoned. And since I don't use the lock button and I don't use the rate button, and there are certain things that I'd love to be able to program to buttons, but I don't have enough buttons to program, it would be really nice for us to be able to customize the lock and rate button to camera function, as you can with most of the other buttons on the camera. And for that matter, I would really like Canon to open up with, stop limiting certain controls to certain buttons. Let us put pretty much anything anywhere. I don't see any reason that the software would be it can't be done in software or whatnot. Let us do that. Number 6 on the list, better control over the in-body image stabilizer. So now what I'm talking about here isn't like turning off pitch or roll or something like that, or tuning it or something like that. I'm simply talking about turning it on and turning it off. So the way Canon set up the R5 is essentially it's dependent on, it's not entirely dependent on, but essentially it favors the image stabilizer switch on your lenses. So even the RF lenses that have image stabilizers, there's a switch on the lens. And if you switch that on, the camera turns on the lens's image stabilizer. It also turns on the in-body image stabilizer. And then they do whatever they're doing. So, hybrid, whatever they call it, where they work together, or in the case of like if you're using EF lenses, the lens does some things and the in-body system does other things. But the point is here, well, the problem that I've run into is several of my EF lenses that I use, and the only RF lens that I will own eventually, at the time being at least, which is the 28-70 f2, don't have image stabilization. So they don't have an IS switch in the lens or on the lens. And so the problem I've run into, for example, this is a 24-70 f2.8 EF lens on the camera. It's not image stabilized. Before I was shooting with this lens, I may have had an image stabilized lens on the camera, and I may have been shooting on a tripod with a lot of my EF lenses are old enough that they don't have tripod detect for auto image stabilization, so I turn the image stabilizer off. So turn off the image stabilizer, dismount the lens, put this lens on, now the image stabilization system on the camera is off. And to turn it back on, I can't just flip a switch on the lens or hit a button on the body, like the rate button would be great. I have to dig through the menus, go to the IS settings, and turn IS, or image stabilization, back on. And this is, for me, kind of frustrating, because it's the kind of thing that I would love to have a button somewhere, or a default, like just have the camera, if a non-image stabilized lens is mounted, switch on the image stabilizer so that things work. But there's tons of options here. There could be an entry in the quick control screen. You could be able to, again, customize the quick control menu to have an IS on, IS off button, feature, whatever you want to call it. Something like that. Just better, an easier ability to turn the image stabilizer system on when I've dismounted a lens, or with a lens that doesn't have a switch on it. Kind of on the same vein, I'm not going to get too in the weeds on this, but I'd also love it if the menu for the image stabilizer just didn't say image stabilization. It actually indicated the kind of current settings. But that's kind of a menu thing. Number 7 on the list, extended shutter speeds. So this is a feature that Nikon has on their Z series cameras, and I think it's a pretty nice feature. I don't know how much I use it, but I also don't see there being a huge cost to Canon to implement something like this. So basically, the R5, like pretty much every Canon camera, has a shutter speed range of 1/8,000th of a second, or whatever your high end is. In this case, it's the 8,000. It's an 8,000th of a second, all the way down to 30 seconds. And when you get to 30 seconds, that's it. You're done. If you want to go longer than that, you have to put the camera in bulb and use a bulb timer or a cable release with a interval timer or a long exposure timer. On Nikon Z6 and 7s, their mirrorless cameras, or I should say their mirrorless cameras, you can enable an option for extended shutter speeds, which adds shutter speeds up to 15 or 16 minutes in third stop increments. Now, I understand why there is a historical precedent to limiting the shutter speeds for auto exposures to 30 seconds. And it goes back to film, and it goes back to reciprocity failures. So with film, if you have a long, and this depends on the film stock, if you have a long exposure, say 30 seconds or more, you can start getting color shifts because the way the film absorbs light isn't linear, uniform, and consistent. It's what's called a reciprocity failure. And limiting the exposure meter on the camera to a maximum of 30 seconds provides the photographer with some protection that they're not going to go to take a picture and the camera calculates that it's a 2-minute exposure and they don't have the right filter on or something like that to deal with the reciprocity failure, or that their 2-minute exposure had to be a 4-minute exposure because of the reciprocity failure. Now, digital cameras are not subject to this. They don't get color shifts because you took a 30-second or a 5-minute exposure. They just work. And the need to protect the photographer from a 2-minute exposure needing to be a 4-minute exposure, or to make it like to protect the photographer basically, isn't really there anymore. And of course, there's no technical limitation in the camera to doing a long exposure because, well, you can put a bulb timer on here and you can open the shutter and have the camera shoot for 4, 5, 6 hours, and it works just fine as long as you obviously don't run out of battery power. So first of all, like I said, I'd like to see extended shutter speeds because there are cases where that would be useful, especially if you combined it with the neutral density stuff. But even just using a 10-stop neutral density filter, it would be useful to have those extended shutter speeds. As a kind of caveat to this, without making it a whole nother thing, if the Canon didn't want to make the extended shutter speeds, I'd like to just see the bulb timer in the camera easier to use. Like, it's kind of silly to me that it's in many ways faster for me to hook up my TC80N3 timer cable release to the camera and set an exposure time than it is for me to go through the menus for the bulb timer to get the camera set to a given long exposure time. Number 8 on my list. So this one is a bit of a, I'd be nice to have. I don't know how practical it actually is. But what I'd like to see is smarter sensor cleaning stuff. So as things currently stand, the self-cleaning sensor in the R5 you can set to one of 3 options. At power off, enabled where it goes at power on and powered off, and disabled. And I would like to see some smarts built into this. Now, there's nothing, as far as I know, wrong or problematic with running the sensor cleaning like frequently. It's probably good, but sometimes it also feels like it might be a bit excessive for it to be running, every time I turn the camera on, every time I turn the camera off, and not to have like, does it need to run if I turn the camera on, turn it off, and then turn it back on? Like, some more than a 5-second timer or whatever it is that it has, because it actually will sort of not run constantly like that. But you see what I'm saying, I hope. The big one, though, for me is the time that I really think the sensor needs to be cleaned is when you change lenses. And this is less of a case on the R5 because it does have a shutter that closes when you turn the camera off, or can close when you turn the camera off, so that it protects the sensor when you're changing lenses. But I would, and of course, the manual says to turn the camera off when you change lenses. However, the reality is I have never met a photographer who does that, or does that consistently, or does that all the time. So, having just a little bit more smarts, if it's possible, in the sensor cleaning, so that, like, run the sensor cleaner. If it detects that you've changed the lens when the camera is powered on, so like, it could use serial number, for instance. Save the last lens serial number. If the lens serial number is different, run the sensor clean. Just as an extra layer of, I don't know, precaution or something like that. Like I said, not a big one, not really hard to add. I think it would be nice to have. Going along that same vein, for number 9 on the list, is a smarter option for the shutter. Now, this also falls in the, I don't know if this is really that important, but it would be nice to have. Specifically, what I'm talking about goes back to what I was saying about no photographer that I know actually turns their camera off when they change lenses. Or they'll change lenses, they may mean to, but they will forget to. So what I'm suggesting is detect when the lens is being removed and close the shutter. I don't see that being tremendously difficult. Obviously, I haven't torn into the ins and outs of the camera. I do know that the R5 doesn't have the little micro switch that many DSLRs have to close the shutter and mirror when a lens is removed. But it seems like something that Canon could detect, like the power gets disconnected. If you start removing a lens, the contacts break, something like that. Just like I said, it's not a major thing. It's just a thing that I think would be nice to have. And number 10, and this is probably should be way higher up on my list, but it's so trivial in some respects that I'm probably the only person that's really agitated, or I shouldn't say agitated. It really grinds my gears. But dear Canon, clean up the menus on the R5. So I generally have always liked Canon's menus on their cameras. I've found them to be pretty good, pretty, usable, pretty consistent, pretty intelligent. Now, I'm not saying that's the case for everybody, but it's been the case for me. One of the things that I noticed going from the 5D Mark IV to the R5 is that the menus have become an absolute, like, mess. They're all over the place. So Canon can't seem to decide whether the nomenclature for turning something on or off should be on or off, or enabled or disabled. And the worst case is there's actually a menu in the camera, or a function in the camera, where if you hit the set button to change the option, it takes you to a page, it's a whole new menu screen, and I'll show it to you here, that it's a whole new menu screen, and it says, I think it's, as I'm not looking at it as I'm recording this, it says like, enabled on, disabled off. And it's like, why? What, like, did something get lost in the translation from the original Japanese design? Like, why would you even do that? And there's a slew of instances throughout the camera where there's, huge, just massive inconsistencies in justification of how settings and menu labels and settings are showed. In some place, the labels left justified, the settings right justified. In other places, the labels left justified, and then there's like a couple of spaces and the setting that is currently set. It's just a mess. And then on top of that, there are places where Canon is using little icons that are very hard to distinguish. So the one that jumps out to me is the 20 frame or the 120 frame per second viewfinder high frame rate mode. Instead of having an option in the menu say called something like high frame rate viewfinder and then on or off or enabled or disabled or whatever Canon goes to go with, you know, on for the nomenclature, it's actually two little icons, and the difference between the icons is an up arrow or a plus or something like that. And it's incredibly hard to see when you're trying to look quickly at what settings are. And it's just, it's bad design as far as I'm concerned from a user interface standpoint. Additionally, cleaning in the vein of cleaning up the menus, when there's a setting that is only two options, on and off, don't give me a drop down. Like camera or phone manufacturers have figured this out for, you know, for ages. If you have to toggle between settings, they give you a little toggle switch and you tap it and it turns the setting on or off. Like, it's not jump through a menu and push this and hit save and do the next thing. On these cameras, on the R5, all of Canon's cameras, there's, you know, you scroll down to a setting that you can switch between on and off, and you hit set, and I'm talking through this using the dials as opposed to the touch screen, but it's basically the same thing if you use the touch screen. You hit set. Now, in the past, it would give you like a little drop-down menu that had on, off, or enable, disable, whatever the, you know, setting was. Now half the time it takes you to a whole new menu screen that just has on, off. Other times it does the little drop down, both of which is inconsistent, and that annoys me. But anyway, you hit set, then you have to scroll down to the other option. So if it was enabled, you scroll to disabled, etc. Then you hit set again, and then the setting is set. Why can't I just hit set once and have it switch from on to off or off to on or whatever? Like, this is stuff that shouldn't be, you know, it's, okay, so this is the thing. I've done user interface work on websites and something like that, stuff like that. And I understand that a lot of this stuff is, it's a 10% thing that's like 90% of the work. It's a pain in the butt to do all of this and have everything be consistent and so on and so forth and go through. And the payoff, you know, at least if you're talking like professional software development, the payoff is, well, you didn't add a new feature to the Canon. It's kind of like fixing bugs. There just isn't a huge reward to the developers, and in the payment infrastructure, the reward. What do I want to call it? The incentive, essentially. There isn't a huge incentive for this to be worked on. However, as a user, this is the kind of thing that just, like, as a user who's had to deal with this stuff, this is the kind of thing that just kind of grinds my gears. Does it make the camera any less useful or less capable or less effective? No, absolutely not. But it's these little irritating, annoying, like, why is this setting on and the next one's disabled or enabled? Like, they should all be the same thing. And, you know, it shouldn't be that big of a deal, I don't think, for Canon to actually sit down and make all of this stuff a bit more consistent and a bit more intelligent. And a bit clearer, because, like, again, it's a thing. As a photographer, a lot of times I want to go through the camera and I want to see settings and I want to make sure things are set quickly. And that means that things need to be clear. And going from enabled to on is not as easy as just being able to read down the side, on. You know, so I'd like to see Canon fix that. So anyway, if you've made it this far, thanks for watching. If you thought this was interesting or informative, please smash that like button, give it a thumbs up, you know the deal. If you are interested in this kind of content, please consider subscribing. I don't normally use the notification bell on YouTube, and I don't normally, like, I always find it silly when every YouTuber's like, click the notification bell, and they put out like 10 videos a week. So I have a live stream that streams every Friday where I'm talking about stuff related to cameras, and aside from that, these videos come out fairly irregularly. I try to focus on having good content come out, you know, when it's ready, as opposed to rushing some crap out just for the sake of the algorithm, so to speak. So if you are going to subscribe, you might want to consider hitting that notification bell. I don't post 50 videos a week. I post one video, aside from the live stream, I post one video every week or two. I'd like to do one video a week, but it almost never seems to happen. So you might want to hit that, that notification bell, just so you know when I post something. So anyway, like I said, if you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So until next time.